Greetings, I'm Aria, and the past month has been a whirlwind of unbelievable events that have completely transformed my life. Describing the magnitude of this change is challenging, but I'm determined to share this incredible story. It reminds us that life's surprises often lurk just around the corner. Until recently, I led an ordinary teenage life as an only child in a typical middle-class family. Despite the love and pampering from my adoptive parents, I always felt a bit out of place, both at home and at school. Maybe I was a tad eccentric, but it had nothing to do with my parents, who adored me endlessly. Here's an important detail. I'm adopted, but I'm perfectly content with that fact, so no sympathy is necessary. Sadly, my biological parents perished in a car accident shortly after my birth, leaving me with a curiosity about their lives. Regrettably, my adoptive parents didn't possess much information about the circumstances. However, there's an interesting twist. Not many people realize I'm adopted because I bear a striking resemblance to my adoptive parents. It's been a blessing, making my life significantly easier, though they are a bit older. Recently, I discovered a passion for martial arts, one of my many obscure and eclectic interests that my parents always encouraged. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday after school, you'll find me at my martial arts class, where I find an indescribable sense of freedom and empowerment. It serves as a refuge from the typical teenage concerns, like my limited circle of friends and my absence of romantic experiences. During one of my classes, while taking a break to quench my thirst at a vending machine, I noticed an older gentleman nearby. Our eyes met briefly, and then he quickly averted his gaze. I dismissed the encounter, as martial arts allows me to remain firmly rooted in the present. However, on a rainy day not long after, when I had forgotten my umbrella, a car pulled up beside me on the sidewalk, and its window rolled down. I recognized the driver, but his identity eluded me. He kindly offered to give me a ride home, and while I knew it wasn't wise to accept a ride from a stranger, he seemed genuinely amiable. The rain had left me completely drenched, and after considerable hesitation, I relented. I took a seat in the back, and he met my gaze through the rearview mirror. With a laugh, he reassured me, insisting he wasn't a serial killer. Yet, my mind couldn't help but entertain the unsettling possibility. There was something oddly familiar about his eyes. Eventually, he safely dropped me off at home and requested a favor. There was a box on the seat next to me that needed recycling, and he was pressed for time. Although his request struck me as somewhat random, I obliged to avoid any potential confrontation. I bid him farewell and hurried indoors to dry off. My parents were still at work, so I had the house to myself. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to inspect the box before recycling it. To my astonishment, it wasn't empty. Inside, I discovered an array of newspaper clippings, aging photographs, and official-looking documents, all tinged with the patina of time. These documents were all about me, pictures from my infancy, snapshots of me as a toddler. But then, something extraordinary caught my eye. A photograph of me standing alongside a man and a woman. I kid you not, this woman was my spitting image. It was like looking into a mirror. These had to be my biological parents. But who was the man who had given me this mysterious box, and for what reason? Overwhelmed, I sat there in disbelief. As I continued to sift through the contents, I noticed a glaring omission. None of the articles mentioned a car accident or any deaths at all. Could it be that my biological parents were still alive? If so, why have I been adopted? My curiosity drove me to read further, and it swiftly became evident that there was a great deal more to this story than my adoptive parents had ever disclosed. The documents revealed that my biological parents had been teenagers when they had conceived me. Coming from a traditional, conservative background, they have been compelled to give me up. Astonishingly, my mother was only 14 when she had me, and my father was just 16. I couldn't fathom it. I was 14 now, which meant my mother had been my age when she brought me into the world. It was mind-boggling. Then, something even more peculiar dawned on me. My last name was the same as that of my biological parents. But why did we all share the same last name, both my adoptive and birth parents? Was this some bizarre coincidence that defied explanation? The revelation was unsettling, and a sense of sickness welled up within me. Amid the photographs, I stumbled upon a weathered article, and what I saw was beyond belief. It was a photograph featuring my birth parents and my adoptive parents together, captured in the very same frame. Suddenly, it all fell into place. My adoptive parents were, in fact, my grandparents. But what did this mean? I couldn't even bring myself to entertain the thought that was forming in my mind. My adoptive parents, now revealed as my grandparents, had concealed a cruel and shocking secret from me. How could they have orchestrated such a deception and kept it hidden for so long? The article disclosed that they had been so ashamed of their daughter's teenage pregnancy that they had sent her to a boarding school, instructing her not to return until she had mended her ways. It was all documented in the newspapers, yet I had no inkling that my adoptive parents had ever had another child before me. In hindsight, it made sense that they were particularly skilled at raising a child. They had experience. My thoughts raced to my biological father. Could he still be alive? As I sat there, contemplating how I might finally meet my true parents, my adoptive parents entered the room. They immediately sensed that something was amiss. Before I could utter a word, my father seized the box from my grasp and hastily fled the house with it. That was the end of it. Fueled by anger and disbelief, I began to unleash my frustrations on my mother. "I can't believe you," I yelled, my voice shaking with rage. "You're a liar. How could you lie like this? You told me my mother was dead, but she's your daughter. You're my grandma." My tirade continued, with her sitting there, sobbing, explaining that she had done it for her daughter's sake and mine. She argued that if people discovered her 14-year-old daughter had given birth, it would have torn our family apart irreparably. I couldn't bring myself to care about her justifications. I was too stunned and horrified that she could fabricate the death of her own child. What kind of person could perpetrate such a twisted deception? I retreated to my room and locked the door, desperate to distance myself from the people who had become an enigma to me. My grandparents, my adoptive parents. The labels no longer made sense. Later that night, my father, or shall I say my grandfather, returned home inebriated. The sound of their heated arguments echoed through the night. Clinging to one photograph salvaged from the box, a picture of me with my real parents, I found solace. The man in the photo seemed so familiar, and in the dead of night, it struck me. I knew who he was. The man in the photograph was the very same person who had given me a ride home. It was him. I was certain of it. This meant I had met my father, and my heart felt like it might cease beating. I had an urgent need to find him, but I didn't have to search for long. He arrived at our door the next morning. My parents were reluctant to let him in, but I pushed past them and swung open the door. Tears streamed down his face as he explained that he had been attempting to reach me for months. We collapsed into each other's arms, tears mingling, while my parents stood in stunned silence. His tears flowed incessantly, and he apologized profusely, though he felt it was too late. He conveyed that my mother had longed to meet me for years, but now that opportunity was forever lost. I struggled to grasp his words through his tears until he finally broke the devastating news. My mother had been diagnosed with cancer the previous year, and tragically, she had passed away that very morning. My world unraveled. My adoptive parents, who stood behind me, were suddenly consumed by hysteria. I initially thought my mother was experiencing a panic attack, but the truth was far more harrowing. Their daughter was gone, and they hadn't seen her in 14 years. It felt like a scene from a surreal movie, too unbelievable to be real. They were my grandparents, and he was my father, and here he was, informing us of my real mother's recent demise. I had lost her all over again, this time for real. When I was young, I had come to terms with the notion that she had died in a car accident. Now, I found myself mourning her all over again, except this time, it was for her genuine passing. And I hadn't even had the chance to meet her. That day, we sat down together and began the somber task of making funeral arrangements. It was a task none of us had ever anticipated, but it was a necessary one. Despite the lingering resentment my real dad harbored toward my grandparents, or my adoptive parents, as they were now known, he understood the importance of sitting down with them and resolving this tangled web of emotions. Even if it was solely for my sake, I considered myself incredibly fortunate to have finally met my true father. It felt as though he had come back from the dead, but his presence had also completely upended my life. I knew I had to find a way to extend forgiveness to my grandparents. They were already burdened with the weight of my mom's passing, and I couldn't bear the thought of abandoning them in their time of need. My mother's funeral became one of the most surreal experiences of my life. Imagine attending the funeral of a mother you had never met, a concept that weighed heavily on my heart. It was a day that left me utterly devastated, the most challenging day I had ever faced. In time, I found it within me to fully forgive my grandparents. I began spending a lot of time with my dad, and I was astounded by the striking similarities between us. We shared a mutual love for martial arts, and suddenly, my seemingly obscure interests didn't seem so out of the ordinary after all. So, even though I had never had the chance to meet my mother, I had at least found my father. In a strange way, I considered it a blessing. Now, I had grandparents and a father, a remarkable transition from believing my parents were deceased to discovering that they had been alive all along. Life, as it turned out, could be remarkably unpredictable and full of surprises.